Ride into Larkspur Valley on a frozen night, because the quiet drifter she just hired was hunting the man who murdered her husband, and neither one of them had spoken the truth of it out loud yet. Watch him close, because everything about him was built to be forgotten the second he passed. The hat pulled low, the coat too thin for the weather, the way he never let his back find a wall he hadn't already measured with his eyes first. Men like that don't ride into a valley by accident. They ride in because something pulled them there, patient as a debt coming due. And on this particular night in the winter of 1887, in the Montana Territory, what pulled him was a widow named Sadie Marsh, who owned the only spring that never froze in the whole of Larkspur Valley, who had decided that spring belonged to him now. Merrick had spent 6 years buying up every homestead between the two ridge lines, one bad winter and one broken family at a time. And the Marsh place was the only piece of ground left that he didn't own. He wanted it badly. He was patient enough to starve her out of it, and cruel enough to help the starving along whenever patience alone moved too slow for his liking. What Silas Merrick did not know, what nobody in that valley knew, not the sheriff who took his money, and not the widow who'd hired a stranger out of pure desperation, was that the fever that had killed Sadie's husband 3 winters before, it had been Silas Merrick's doing, planned and paid for, and the quiet man walking her fence line for $1 a day had come to Larkspur Valley to prove it. Cost him what it would. That is the story I want to tell you tonight, a story about a debt that took 8 seasons to collect, a woman who refused to fold when folding would have been so much easier, and a man who understood better than most. If a story like that is the kind that keeps you here past the first 10 minutes, stay with me all the way to the end. Because before the snow melts in this valley, Silas Merrick is going to learn exactly what he bought when he crossed a dead man's widow, and exactly what walked in behind her, quiet and patient as he was. Now, let's go back to where it actually started. 3 winters before that frozen night, back before anyone in Larkspur Valley had ever heard the name Boone. Sadie Marsh had not planned on becoming the kind of woman folks whispered about at the mercantile counter, the stubborn one, the widow who wouldn't sell, the fool holding on to 400 acres she couldn't hope to work alone. She had planned once on a much simpler life. She and her husband Eli had come up from the Nebraska flatlands 9 years earlier with a wagon, 2 mules, and enough seed corn to gamble on a homestead claim nobody else wanted, because nobody else wanted the rocky north end of the valley where the only water was a spring that bubbled cold and clean out of a limestone shelf. Eli had named it Foolishness Turned Fortune, half joking the way a man does, when he isn't fully sure yet whether the joke will hold. He dug the well by hand that first summer, built the house board by board through 2 hard winters, and by the 3rd year, the Marsh place had the only water in Larkspur Valley that never quit. Not in drought, not in the deep freeze. Every rancher downstream of that spring owed his herd's survival, one way or another, to a stubborn young man's hand-dug well. It should have made them rich. Instead, it made them a target, though neither of them understood that yet. Silas Merrick had ridden into the valley 2 years after the Marshes settled it, with a lawyer's satchel, a line of credit out of Helena, and the kind of smile that made men count their fingers after shaking his hand. He bought the Dunmore spread first, then the Pruitt claim, then old man Castellan's grazing land after a brutal winter, broke the Castellans' herd, and their spirit both. Each purchase came dressed up as a kindness, a fair price, a generous offer to a struggling neighbor, a helping hand extended at exactly the moment a family had no strength left to refuse it. By the time Eli Marsh turned 34, Silas Merrick's cattle grazed every acre of Larkspur Valley except the 400 that belonged to a stubborn homesteader and his water. Eli turned down every offer Merrick made, and he turned them down politely, which seemed to needle Merrick worse than an angry refusal ever could have. "Where's your law?" Merrick used to ask, half joking, half not, meaning the piece of paper, meaning the water rights filed at the Territorial Land Office that made the spring, legally, unshakably, the Marsh's to keep or to sell as they pleased. Eli's answer never varied. Right here, and he'd touch 2 fingers to his own chest, as if the water belonged to him the way his own blood did, because in every way that mattered to him it did. Eli Marsh died in the autumn of 1884, in the space of 11 days, from what the valley doctor recorded as a wasting fever. He'd been a big man, strong through the shoulders, the kind who didn't take sick easily, and then all at once he did, weak and sweating. Doc Tilson wrote fever in his ledger and in the church record both, and nobody in Larkspur Valley had any reason to write anything different, because nobody in Larkspur Valley knew that 2 of Silas Merrick's men had been dosing the marsh well water with arsenic for the better part of a month. Gone an amount small enough that a strong man simply seemed to weaken and fade rather than die outright of poison. Small enough that no doctor in a frontier valley. Sadie buried her husband on a hillside within sight of the spring he'd dug, and she did not sell. She had every reason to. She was 29 years old, with no children, a mortgage note held at the Helena Bank, 400 acres. She could not hope to work alone, and a cattle baron circling her like weather, circling a barn waiting to break open. Every neighbor who might once have helped her was now on Merrick's payroll, one way or another, grazing his cattle, running his errands, too frightened or too indebted to cross him for a widow's sake. Merrick's foreman came around within a month of the funeral with an offer generous enough to let her leave the valley with money in her pocket and start fresh somewhere the wind didn't carry her husband's name. Sadie answered him plain, the same word she'd give twice more to Merrick's lawyers over the following year. "This spring is my husband's, and it is going to stay mine, and you can carry that back to Mr. Merrick yourself." For 3 years she made it work through sheer stubbornness and the help of an old hand named Otis Kane, a widower himself who'd worked the valley longer than Merrick had owned any of it, and who stayed on for wages Sadie could barely afford because he'd loved Eli Marsh like a son, and couldn't stomach watching Merrick swallow the last piece of ground the man had built with his own hands. But Merrick did not need to be quick. He only needed to be patient, and patience was the one resource a cattle baron with 6 years of momentum had in endless supply. He fenced off the county road that used to run past the marsh gate, forcing Sadie's supply wagon onto a route 2 days longer. He leaned on the freight company and Coldwater Crossing until they quietly stopped taking her orders altogether. He bought the only other blacksmith within reach and let word spread that the smith who served the Marsh widow would lose Merrick's business entirely. And in the winter of 1886 he did something crueler than any of it. His men poisoned 2 of her cattle, not enough to be provable in any court, just enough to be a message, and left the carcasses where Sadie would find them at first light with the frost still on their open eyes. That was the winter Otis Kane, 71 years old, and, afraid for the first time in a life spent mostly unafraid, admitted he couldn't do it anymore. Standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat in both hands, unable to meet her eyes straight on, He warned her that Merrick's men weren't fence riders anymore. "They mean to break something," he said, "and I won't be able to stop them, and neither will you, alone, against that many." Sadie didn't hold it against him. She thanked him for 9 years of loyalty and watched him ride off toward Coldwater Crossing. And that night, alone in a house Eli had built board by board, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote letters to the territorial marshal's office in Helena, to anyone whose title suggested they might care that a cattle baron was strangling a widow out of her water rights, one small cruelty at a time. The letters that came back, on the rare occasions any came back at all, were polite and entirely useless. Land disputes, one of them named it, as though Merrick's campaign against her were a disagreement between equals rather than a slow, deliberate execution carried out at a distance. Sheriff Amos Tall of Coldwater Crossing, the only law within a day's ride, made it plain, more than once, that he saw no crime in a man buying land other men were willing to sell, and everyone in the valley understood, without a soul saying it plainly. That Sheriff Tull's understanding of the law bent whichever direction Silas Merrick's money happened to point it that season. The rest of Larkspur Valley watched the widows fight from a careful distance, the way people watch a fire they're afraid might jump the road onto their own roof. The Pruitts had taken Merrick's money and moved on to Oregon country 2 winters back. The Dunmores had scattered one son working a Helena stockyard. The daughters married off to men in towns far enough away that the name Merrick meant nothing to them. Old man Castellan still lived in the valley, technically, in a small cabin on land that used to be his own grazing range, now leasing back a fraction of what he'd once owned at a price Merrick set, and Merrick could change whenever he pleased. None of them wished Sadie ill. Most of them, in the privacy of their own kitchens, admired her for holding out as long as she had. But admiration didn't translate into help, not when helping her meant crossing a man who controlled the freight, the banknote, and half the law in the county besides. Sadie understood that better than anyone. She had stopped waiting on the valley to save her somewhere around her second winter alone, and had simply set her jaw and kept digging in, the same stubborn way her husband had once dug a well through solid limestone, with nothing but his own 2 hands and a will nobody in the valley had ever managed to break. By the winter of 1887, Sadie Marsh was down to her last real option, and she knew it in her bones. She could not run the fence lines alone through a Montana winter, could not stand watch every night against men who came only when they knew she was unwatched, could not keep 400 acres and one irreplaceable spring safe with nothing but a shotgun she'd never once had caused a fire in anger. She needed a hand. She needed, if she was honest with herself in the cold hours before dawn, someone Merrick's men would think twice about crossing, and every able-bodied hand left in Larkspur Valley already drew Merrick's wages or feared his reach too much to draw hers instead. So, on a gray morning in early December, with frost already thick on the wagon ruts, Sadie hitched her one remaining horse and drove 2 hours to Coldwater Crossing, to the only place in the territory where a person looking for work she couldn't fully advertise for, where drifters and drovers and men, caught between jobs, came to wait out the winter before the spring cattle drives started up again. She nearly turned back twice on the ride-in. She was not a woman, accustomed to walking into a room full of strange men and asking out loud for help she couldn't fully explain the danger of. But she thought of the spring, and of Eli's hands blistered raw from digging it, and she walked through the saloon doors with her chin up and her voice steady, and announced to the room in general that she needed a man for winter wages, $1 a day, a bunk, and 3 meals to guard fence line on a working ranch, and that the work might turn out harder and meaner than it sounded on its face. Most of the room went back to their cards without so much as looking up. One man laughed outright, loud enough that his friends joined in. But in the far corner, at a table nobody else had chosen to sit near, lean stranger in a thin coat sat down his coffee cup and studied her for a long moment. The kind of look that seemed to weigh her whole situation in a single unhurried pass. The mended coat, the calloused hands, the way she stood like someone bracing against a wind only she could feel. "I'll take the work," was all he offered. No questions about the danger she'd half warned him of, no haggling over the $1 a day, no idle curiosity about a widow hiring strangers in a saloon in the dead of winter. He gave his name as Boone, nothing more. Volunteered and nothing more asked for, and when he stood to follow her out, Sadie noticed that every man at the bar within 10 feet of him had left an empty stool on either side, the way men will sometimes clear space around something they can't quite name. She didn't know, riding back to the ranch beside a stranger who spoke perhaps 40 words the whole 2 hours, that the empty stools weren't superstition at all. Boone had once carried a Deputy United States Marshal's badge for 6 years, had closed 14 federal warrants under his own name, and had earned a reputation in certain quiet circles from the Dakotas down through the territory. She didn't know he'd turned that badge in 8 months earlier, walked away from a federal salary and a pension coming due, for one reason, and one reason only. She didn't know the name Marsh had brought him to Coldwater Crossing 3 full days before she ever walked into that saloon, that he'd been asking around town, quiet and careful, about a widow's ranch and a cattle baron's reach for the better part of a week before she ever hired him at all. She only knew that something about him eased just slightly, a hollow and frightened place in her chest that had gone unrelieved for 3 long years. The first days proved that hiring him had been the right decision, even before she could fully say why. Boone didn't sit idle, waiting for trouble to find him. He walked the entire perimeter of the Marsh place on his first full day, on foot in the biting cold, studying the fence lines and the tree cover and the low mesa to the north where a man could sit horseback and watch the house for hours without ever once being seen from the yard below. He asked for a map of the property, and when she admitted she didn't have one, he sketched his own from memory after that single boundary walk, marking the gate, the choke point where the wagon road narrowed between 2 rock outcrops, the places where the fence sagged low enough for a rider to jump without dismounting. He wasn't a talker. When he did speak, it came short and useful. Where does that draw run in a hard rain? How many horses do you keep? Does anyone besides Merrick's men know the layout of your barn and your outbuildings? Sadie watched him those first days more than she let on, the way a person watches something they can't yet decide whether to trust. There was nothing wasted in how he moved. No idle motion, no restless fidgeting, the way most hired hands filled quiet hours. He split wood like it was a chore he'd done 10,000 times over, mended a sagging length of fence without being asked, and twice she caught him standing dead still at the edge of the yard at dusk, simply watching the tree line the way a man watches for weather he already half expects. He ate what she cooked without complaint, thanked her plainly each time, and retreated each night to the small room off the barn without ever once making her feel unsafe in her own house. A small mercy she hadn't realized she'd been bracing herself against until she noticed its absence. Whatever burden the man carried, and by the set of his shoulders some evenings, she was certain he carried one. He kept it folded up, small, and out of her way, the way a considerate guest keeps his boots off the good rug. On the fourth morning, 5 riders came through the north gate at first light, and Boone was the one who walked out to meet them alone, unhurried. His rifle held loose and low, in a way that somehow read as more dangerous than if he'd carried it raised and ready. The rider in front was a broad man with a bought deputy's badge pinned crooked to his coat, a man named Cole Rennick, who did most of Merrick's talking when talking still seemed cheaper than force. Rennick looked Boone over the way a buyer looks over a horse he's already decided to reject, and warned him this was Merrick range now on 3 sides, and that a smart hired hand wouldn't want to make enemies over a losing property in his first week of work. Gate was closed when I walked it at dawn. It's open now, Boone answered, unhurried. I'll ask you to close it on your way back through, and I'll ask you not to come through it again without an invitation. It's a promise, and I only make the kind I keep. Rennick laughed, the nervous kind of laugh men make while they're still deciding whether to be afraid, and tossed out some remark about $1 a day hand having a lot of mouth on him for a stranger. Boone let it pass without answering at all. He simply stood there, still as the fence post beside him, until the silence itself became the answer he wanted. And after a long, uncomfortable minute, Rennick ordered his men to fall back, muttering something under his breath about this not being finished. Boone watched all 5 riders out through the gate and closed it behind them himself. And when he came back to the house, Sadie was standing on the porch with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, having watched the whole exchange through the kitchen window. That's 5 men Silas Merrick sent to test one hired hand. She managed once he was close enough to hear her without raising her voice. Most men I could have hired would already be halfway back to Coldwater Crossing by now. I'm not most men, Boone answered, and something in the flatness of it made her look at him twice and wonder, not for the first time that week, exactly what kind of man she had hired. It was another 11 days before the truth finally came out, and it came out in the end, because Sadie asked a question she'd been circling for almost 2 weeks without quite letting herself land on it. It was a bitter night, wind rattling the shutters he'd only just finished hanging, the 2 of them at the kitchen table over coffee gone lukewarm, because neither one wanted to be the first to stand and end the conversation. Sadie had been telling him, without quite meaning to unburden herself the way she did, about Eli, about the well he dug by hand, about the fever that took him in 11 days, about how strange it had always felt to her that a man built like an ox could go down so fast and never once get better, not even a little. Boone had gone very still across the table. The particular stillness she'd already learned meant he was choosing his next words with more care than usual, weighing them the way a man weighs a debt before he pays it. I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear the whole of it before you answer back, he began. Your husband's name was Eli Marsh. Before you 2 ever came up from Nebraska, he rode 2 years as a civilian scout out of Fort Larned. And there was another scout riding with him half that time, a man who owed Eli Marsh his life twice over. Once when a river crossing went wrong, and once when a raiding party nearly caught them both out in the open with nowhere to run. That man never forgot what he owed. And when word finally reached him, 8 months ago, that Eli Marsh had died of a sudden fever 3 years into working the best water claim in a valley a cattle baron wanted for himself, that man didn't believe the word fever for a single day. Sadie's coffee cup had gone still in her hand, "You?" she managed. "You're talking about you. I rode a federal badge for 6 years before I turned it in. 14 warrants closed with my name on the paperwork," he went on. "I turned that badge in 8 months ago because chasing outlaws for the government was never going to get me what I actually wanted, which was time to find out exactly how Eli Marsh died and exactly who was responsible. I've spent those 8 months in 3 different territories, talking to men who worked for Silas Merrick at one point or another. 2 of them, separately, gave me the same account before I ever set foot in Larkspur Valley. Merrick had 2 of his men poison your well the summer before your husband died. Small doses, slow, built to look exactly like what your doctor wrote down on his chart. A strong man wasted to nothing over 11 days, and nobody ever thought past the word fever, because why in this world would they? The kitchen was silent, except for the wind working at the shutters. Sadie set the cup down very carefully, as though her own hands had become something she no longer entirely trusted to hold anything steady. "Say it plain," she managed. "Don't soften it for me, not one word of it." Silas Merrick ordered it, and 2 of his men carried it out, and I came to Larkspur Valley to prove it in a court of law and see every one of them hang or rot for it. I hired on for $1 a day guarding your fence line because it put me on this ground, close enough to do both things at once: protect you and finish what I came here to do. Sadie sat with that for a long moment, staring at the man across her kitchen table as though seeing him for the very first time, which, in the ways that mattered most, she was. "That's either the most honest thing a man has ever said to me in my own kitchen," she finally managed, "or it's the most convenient lie I've ever swallowed." "I know which it is," he answered, quiet and even. "I understand you don't yet. I'm not asking you to take my word for the poison. I intend to prove it, with something a good deal better than my word alone. I'm asking you to let me stay and finish it, because Merrick isn't done with you, and after tonight, I don't imagine you want to face what's coming without someone in this house who already buried a friend to that man's cruelty and has spent 8 months learning exactly how he operates." She didn't answer right away. She rose instead, walked to the window, and stood looking out at the dark shape of the spring house against the snow for a long while, long enough that Boone let the silence hold rather than fill it with anything more. When she finally turned back, her eyes were wet, but her voice came out steady. "Stay, finish it. And God help you if you're lying to me, Boone, because I've buried one man already, and I don't have the strength left in me to bury a second lie on top of him. I'm not in the habit of lying to widows," he said low. "I'm in the habit of finishing what men like Merrick start, and think nobody will ever come to collect on." Before we ride any deeper into this valley, I want to say something to the people who've stayed with me this far, because you're the reason these forgotten homesteaders and their fights get told at all. If Sadie Marsh's fight is the kind of story you want more of, consider becoming a member of this channel. Just tap the join button beside the channel name. It costs a few minutes' thought, and tells us these true frontier stories are worth keeping alive. From that night on, the ranch changed under Boone's hands, quietly and thoroughly, the way a fortress gets built by a man who has spent years learning exactly where an enemy will look for weakness first. He simply began, each morning before Sadie was fully awake, walking the same ground again and again until he knew every rise and hollow of it better than his own 2 hands. He strung tripwires low across the 2 most obvious approach routes to the house, each one rigged to a scatter of tin cans filled with pebbles, hung just high enough in the brush that a horse's leg would find them in the dark no matter how careful the rider tried to be. He cleared the brush back from both sides of the north gate so that anyone coming through after dark would stand lit plain by moonlight with nowhere close to hide. And he set a line of fence posts at angles inside the gate that made no sense to Sadie at first, until he explained, patient as ever, almost without realizing it, into a narrow lane that put him square in the open ground below the house windows, a kill lane, though Boone never once used that particular word with her, preferring to call it simply the channel. He built shutters for the 2 windows facing the yard, heavy enough to stop a rifle round, hinged so they could drop shut in seconds and swing back open just as fast, with a narrow firing slot cut into each one at exactly Sadie's shoulder height. He hung Eli's old Spencer rifle, cleaned and oiled and freshly loaded, on pegs beside the north window, within easy reach of the kitchen table. He rigged a second, smaller trip line, closer to the barn itself, one meant only to buy seconds rather than sound a full alarm, and a third along a low draw where a careful man might otherwise slip in unseen from the creek bottom. And on a cold, still afternoon, in the second week of December, he did something that surprised her more than any trap or shutter had managed to. He handed her the Spencer and told her it was time she learned to use it properly, not as a thing to threaten with, but as a thing she trusted well enough to rely on when it mattered. Sadie had fired a shotgun exactly twice in her life, both times at coyotes worrying the chicken coop, both times more out of noise than aim. He taught her to breathe before she squeezed, rather than after, to find her target and hold on it rather than snap the shot away too fast, to load and reload with her eyes still on the yard rather than drop down to her own hands. She proved, it turned out, a natural in a way that plainly surprised even him, steady-handed, unflinching at the recoil, quick to correct her own aim without needing to be told twice about it. By the second afternoon of practice, she was putting shots into a fence post at 60 yards, with a consistency that made Boone go quiet in a way she was starting to recognize as something close to genuine respect. "You don't flinch," he noted once, watching her reload with hands that had gone from trembling to certain in under a week's practice. "Most people flinch the first dozen times at least. You went right past it without stopping." "I buried my husband and kept this ranch alone for 3 years," she answered, working the lever smooth as anything. "I expect I ran out of flinch a good while back, before you ever rode into this valley." He rigged one more thing before the month was out, quieter than the traps, and it mattered to her more than any of them, though she didn't fully understand why until much later. He taught her a signal, nothing dramatic, just her own name, spoken in a certain, flat, calm register that meant get to the window, get low, and trust that whatever was coming, he had already accounted for it. "Say my name like that, and it means I've got eyes on something out there," he explained. "Say it any other way, and it just means I want my coffee." The days between the shooting lessons and Christmas fell into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Chores done together in the cold mornings, quiet suppers where Boone talked a little more than he had that first week. Evenings by the fire where Sadie found herself, more than once, telling him things about Eli she'd never said aloud to another living soul. And Boone, listening the way few men ever had, without once trying to fill the silence that followed. It was not courtship, not yet, not with a debt of blood still hanging unsettled between them, but it was something, some slow warming, neither one named, and both of them noticed it anyway. One such evening, snowbound and quiet, Sadie finally asked him to tell her about the river crossing Eli had once mentioned in passing, years back, without ever finishing the story. Boone was quiet a long while before he answered, turning his coffee cup slow between his hands. Fort Larned country, spring flood, current running twice as hard as it looked from the bank. His horse had gone down under him in the middle of it, and Eli had ridden his own mount straight back into that current, roped him before the water could finish the job, and hauled him out, gasping, on the far bank, half a mile downstream from where either of them had gone in. Man laughed about it after, once he'd stopped coughing up river water, Boone said something almost like warmth cracking through the flatness of his voice, for the first time since she'd known him. Said next time I ought to learn to swim before I went and joined the Scouts. Sadie found herself laughing too, quietly surprised at how much it eased something in her chest to hear Eli spoken of that way, not as a name on a hillside marker, but as a man who'd laughed, coughing river water, teasing a friend who'd just saved his life. That's the first time you've smiled talking about him since the fire told you the truth, Boone observed, watching her across the table. Sadie hadn't noticed it herself until he said so. But he was right, and something about being seen that clearly, by a man who'd earned the right to see her that way, settled a little deeper into her than she was quite ready to examine. Word of the traps and the shooting lessons reached Silas Merrick, as word of everything eventually reached Silas Merrick in a valley he'd spent 6 years buying informants in one loose tongue at a time. It did not slow him down in the least. If anything, it convinced him the widow Marsh had finally hired someone worth removing properly, rather than merely frightening off the way he'd frightened off every hired hand before this one, and Merrick was a man who had never in his life mistaken patience for weakness. He sent Rennick back twice more that December, each time with a slightly larger showing of riders, each time turned away at the gate by a man who never once raised his voice and never once needed to raise it twice. He sent a knife-quick man named Whit Sharp alone one evening, under cover of dusk, to cut the marsh fence a half-mile from the house where Merrick assumed nobody would be watching, and Whit Sharp rode back to Merrick's headquarters with a bloodless cut across his forearm, about a shape that had simply appeared out of the tree line without a sound, and warned him, in a voice with no heat in it at all, that the next man Merrick sent to touch that fence in the dark. In his study that same week, Silas Merrick sat with a glass of good whiskey he barely touched and a map of Larkspur Valley spread across his desk. Every parcel he owned inked in careful red. Every parcel he didn't circled in a plainer, angrier black. He had built an empire, out of patience and other men's desperation, and the sight of 400 stubborn acres, still uncolored on his own map, ate at him worse than any loss of money ever could. He was not a man given to raising his own voice or dirtying his own hands, and that, more than anything, was exactly why he sent for the one man he kept in reserve for work that required neither talk nor mercy, a broad, silent enforcer, whose reputation needed no embellishing because the plain truth of it already frightened men enough on its own. Merrick told Grissom what he wanted done to the Marsh place, and to the hired man who'd made a fool of Cole Rennick twice, and cut Whit Sharp once, and Grissom listened without a single question, and nodded exactly once before he left the room to begin his own quiet counting of men and horses and knights. Sheriff Amos Toole knew, by then roughly what was building in the vague and deniable way, A bought man always knows more than he lets himself examine too closely if he can help it. Merrick had held a debt over Tull's head for 3 years, an old land fraud from before Tull ever pinned on a badge, evidence Merrick had quietly gathered and, just as quietly, never used, keeping it instead like a leash he could tighten whenever it suited him. Tull had spent 3 years telling himself that looking away from Merrick's methods was a different thing entirely from taking part in them. He was about to learn, in the space of one long December night, exactly how thin that difference truly was. Boone knew something was building too, in the particular way a man who'd hunted outlaws for 6 years could feel a valley's temperature dropping well before the storm itself arrived to prove him right. The visits from Rennick's riders had taken on a different rhythm by then, shorter, quieter, more like reconnaissance than plain intimidation. Woodsharp's cut had bought them a week of quiet that felt less like retreat and more like careful preparation for something bigger. And the last Sunday before Christmas, Boone rode into Coldwater Crossing alone under the excuse of buying nails, and came back 3 hours later having learned, through a bartender who owed him a favor from an old federal case, that Silas Merrick had summoned a man named Grissom to the valley. A name that made even the bartender lower his voice near to a whisper before he'd finished saying it. That night, by the fire, Boone laid it out plainly for her, because he had never once believed in softening real danger for a woman who'd already survived 3 years of Merrick's slower, quieter cruelty on her own. He's going to send everyone he has, in one night, all at once, he told her, his voice level and unhurried even now. Enough men that he believes it can't fail. Enough that, even if half of them turn back, the other half still finish it. I need you to trust every trap I've laid and every lesson I've given you, because when it comes, it's going to come fast, and it's going to come in the dark, and there won't be time for either of us to explain a single thing twice. I trust you, she answered, and she meant it in a way that surprised her with how completely true it had become in 3 short weeks of a stranger's company. The night came on the 19th of December, moonless and hard-frozen, the kind of cold that made the fence wire sing faintly whenever the wind found it just right. Sadie had gone to bed early on Boone's instruction, though sleep never came anywhere close to her. She lay fully dressed under 2 quilts with the Spencer within arm's reach, listening to the particular silence of a house that both of them understood was waiting. It was a few minutes past midnight when the first tripwire rang, a thin scatter of tin and pebbles from the tree line north of the barn, and Boone was already moving before the sound had fully died away, a shape sliding out into the dark in a coat the same gray-black as the shadows themselves. 11 men had come for the Marsh place that night. Merrick had not sent half measures this time, had thrown nearly every man on his payroll willing to ride against a woman and her one hired hand, with orders to burn the barn as cover and take the widow while the fire pulled every eye in the valley toward the flames instead of toward them. They had not counted on a man who had spent 3 weeks learning every hollow of that ground better than his own hands, and they had not counted on tripwires strung across every approach that made 11 careful, quiet riders sound in the black stillness of that night. Like 20 men blundering clumsily through brush that rang out like church bells at every step. Inside the house, Sadie lay listening to the bells ring closer, counting the seconds the way Boone had taught her hand steady on the Spencer, even as her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to feel in her throat. She heard the second trip line catch near the barn, and then the third along the low draw, each one buying a few more seconds of warning, each one exactly where he'd said it would be, weeks before. She did not go to the window until she heard her own name spoken. Once, flat and calm, carried faint on the wind from somewhere out near the gate, the signal exactly as he'd taught her. And she rose from the bed without a wasted motion, and crossed to the shuttered window with the rifle already coming up to her shoulder the way 6 weeks of practice had built into her hands, without her needing to think about it at all. Boone let them come as far as the channel between the angled fence posts before he stepped into the open ground and let them see him plainly, rifle held loose, voice carrying flat and calm across the frozen yard. "I'll give you exactly one chance," he called out, to every shape he could make out in the dark. "Turn around, ride back the way you came, and nobody on this ground gets hurt tonight. No harm done if you take it now while it's still on offer." Somewhere in the dark, a rider laughed the way men laugh right before they do something they'll spend the rest of their lives regretting, and spurred his horse forward, and Boone's rifle came up and fired once, and the man's hat left his head clean and sailed off into the snow while the man himself sat his horse in shocked, frozen silence. To entirely unhurt and entirely aware, in that one long heartbeat, exactly how easily that shot could have gone 6 inches lower. In the ringing quiet that followed, the tripwire bells kept sounding from 3 different directions at once, an 11-man force suddenly sounding, in their own frightened ears, twice its real size and coming at them from every side of the dark. That was when the north window shutter dropped open, and Sadie Marsh stood framed inside it with the Spencer rifle braced against her shoulder, and a lamp burning low behind her, throwing her silhouette hard and clear against the glass, unmistakably a woman. "Get off my land," she said, and her voice did not shake at all. Not once. Not even a little. It was Grissom, sitting his horse near the back of the scattered riders, who did the arithmetic fastest. A man who had killed for money across 3 territories and understood, in the particular cold calculation that had kept him alive this long, that a defended position with 2 capable guns and an unknown number of hidden traps was not a fight worth 11 men's lives finishing in the pitch dark for a cattle baron who'd stayed warm. He gave the order to fall back before Merrick's own name was even spoken again, and the 11 riders who had come to burn a barn and take a widow rode out through the north gate in a ragged, frightened column, one of them clutching a bare, hatless head against the cold the whole way. "This isn't over," Grissom called back once, before he turned his horse north, into the dark and the cold swallowed the rest of whatever he might have added. "It's over for tonight," Boone answered, and lowered his rifle and did not fire again for the rest of that long, silent hour. Not one shot had gone into a man's body the whole night through. Every bullet fired had been aimed to frighten, to warn, to end a fight without ending a single life, because Boone had told her once, quietly, that the men riding for Merrick were mostly desperate hands drawing desperate wages. And the man he actually wanted broken by the law was sitting warm 3 miles away, giving orders he'd never once dirty his own hands carrying out himself. If tonight's story has held you this long, this is exactly the moment I'd ask you to think about joining as a member. The button sits right beside the channel name. It helps stories like Sadie and Boone's keep finding people who need a little more grit in their evenings. The morning after the siege, Boone rode to Coldwater Crossing before the sun was fully up, carrying with him something he had been waiting 8 long months to put to proper use. A leather-bound ledger that had reached him by mail 3 years earlier in 3 separate parcels sent by Eli Marsh himself in the final months of his life. Rye had suspected, even before he ever fell sick, that Merrick's campaign against the valley wasn't merely hard business, and being a careful man by nature, he had spent the better part of 16 months quietly recording every land purchase, every threat, every name and date and dollar amount he could piece together of Silas Merrick's slow strangling of Larkspur Valley, and mailed the pages a few at a time to the one man he trusted absolutely to know what to do with them if anything should ever happen to him. Boone had carried that ledger across 3 territories for 8 months, adding his own findings to its final pages as he went, waiting patiently for exactly the kind of overreach that would make it useful in a courtroom. The night siege gave him precisely that overreach. 11 armed men, several of them wearing deputized authority. Sheriff Tull had extended them at Merrick's own quiet request, had ridden against a private citizen's home in the dark, with orders to burn property and take a woman by force. Laid alongside Eli Marsh's careful record of 6 years of coerced land sales, and one very specific entry for arsenic purchased through a Helena supplier. The same month, Eli fell ill, was more than enough to interest a man Boone had corresponded with quietly for most of his 8 months in the territory. Stationed out of Helena, who had been circling Silas Merrick's land dealings from a careful distance for the better part of a year without ever having the one solid piece of leverage, Emery rode into Coldwater Crossing 4 days after the siege with 2 federal deputies and a warrant broad enough to search Merrick's entire operation top to bottom. And what he found there, once Sheriff Amos Tull's nerve finally broke under the weight of straight federal questioning, dismantled 6 years of careful cruelty inside of 3 short weeks. Tull, given the choice between shielding Merrick and saving himself, chose himself without much hesitation, and laid out for Deputy Marshal Emery everything he knew. The old fraud Merrick had held over him for years, the arsenic, the 11 armed men sent against a widow's ranch on a frozen December night under his own deputized authority. Cole Rennick and 2 others were arrested inside the week on charges of extortion, trespass, and conspiracy. Whit Sharp fled the territory rather than face what was coming for him. Grissom simply vanished, the way men like Grissom nearly always seem to, north into country cold enough that nobody much troubled themselves to follow. Silas Merrick himself was taken on the last day of January, at his own front door under a federal warrant that named him directly in the death of Eli Marsh. Not land fraud alone anymore, by 2 of Merrick's former men who finally found the nerve to talk once they understood it was the federal government asking the questions now, and not merely a Bach County sheriff they could still buy their way around. He did not go quietly. He shouted out on his own porch for the whole valley to hear that the water was rightfully his, that a homestead claim by 2 Nebraska nobodies had no business sitting on the only spring worth having in the entire valley, and it did him no good at all, because in every court that mattered, the water had never once belonged to anyone but Sadie Marsh, and never would. Deputy Marshal Emery's team spent the better part of 2 weeks in Coldwater Crossing, working through Eli's ledger page by page against the county land office's own records, and the pattern that emerged was worse even than Boone had expected after 8 months of chasing it. 6 separate families besides the Marshes had sold under some version of the same quiet pressure, a poisoned well here, a burned line shack there, a note called due at the bank a season earlier than any honest lender would have called it. 2 of those families were still living in the territory, close enough for federal deputies to take sworn statements, and both of them, once they understood Merrick could no longer touch them for talking, told everything they'd sat on for years out of plain fear. It was not, in the end, a single ledger or a single siege that broke Silas Merrick's grip on Larkspur Valley. It was the weight of 6 years finally coming due, all at once, the way debts of that size tend to sooner or later, no matter how patiently a man believes he's hidden them. The valley exhaled slowly over the weeks that followed, the way a place does after 6 long years of held breath finally let go. Ranchers who'd sold to Merrick under duress began quietly filing their own complaints once they understood it was safe to speak up at last. The freight company in Coldwater Crossing took Sadie's orders again without being asked twice about it. Neighbors who'd crossed the road rather than meet her eye for 3 years started nodding to her again at church, some of them ashamed. Most of them simply relieved the long threat hanging over the valley had finally lifted. And on a bright, hard-frozen morning in the 3rd week of January, with Silas Merrick already sitting in a territorial jail cell awaiting federal transport, Boone saddled his horse in the marsh yard for what both of them understood, without needing to put it into words. Sadie stood on the porch in the cold arms wrapped around herself the same way she had that first morning Rennick's men came riding through the gate, though everything about how she stood now was different, steadier, unafraid. A woman who had learned in 6 short weeks what most people never learn across a whole lifetime about the exact weight of her own courage. "You could stay," she said. "It wasn't quite a question. Not really. You don't need me to stay." "You know that better than I do by now," he answered, gentle about it. "I don't imagine I'll find another hand like you," she said, and there was a small, dry humor threaded through it that surprised them both. "Find a better one. Find one who never had to walk in here carrying 8 months of somebody else's grief just to be worth trusting in the first place." She crossed the yard to where he stood beside the horse, and for a moment neither one of them said anything at all, the wind moving cold and clean off the spring that had cost her a husband and had very nearly cost her everything else besides it. "Will you come back through here someday?" she finally asked. "If I come this way again," he said, and something in the way he said it told her it was as close to a promise as a man like him knew how to make to anyone. He rode out through the north gate, the same gate 5 riders had once tested him at, the same gate 11 men had come through in the frozen dark and ridden back out of considerably more afraid than they'd arrived that night, and he did not look back, and Sadie did not expect him to, because some men say their goodbyes with their backs turned. So the person watching won't have to see their face do something they never quite intended it to do. She stood on that porch until he was a small dark shape against the white hills, and then smaller still, and then gone north into country that would swallow his trail the way it swallowed most things in that territory, quietly and completely and without a trace left behind. What made this story worth telling in the end was never really the gunfire, and it was never really the traps strung tight across a frozen fence line, or the 11 men who rode away that December night, with their nerve broken and their numbers still whole. It was a widow who buried her husband and refused for 3 long years to let a cattle baron's patience become her defeat. And it was a quiet man who understood something most people never fully learn, that some debts aren't paid with money, and some kinds of loyalty only mean anything once they've cost you something real. A whole winter spent guarding a stranger's fence line for $1 a day that was never, not for one single hour, really about the dollar at all. If Sadie Marsh's fight found something in you tonight, I'd ask 2 small things before you go. First, if this is the kind of true frontier story you want more of in your evenings, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you when it's ready. Second, and this one matters more than you might think, tap Join beside the channel name and become a member. It keeps stories like this one alive. Somewhere north of Larkspur Valley, a quiet man rode on toward whatever debt needed collecting next, because men like Boone rarely stay finished for long. There is always, somewhere, another widow running out of time, another ledger waiting to be found, another valley that hasn't yet learned the difference between a hired hand and a promise kept. And somewhere behind him, in a ranch house built board by a man who dug his own well by hand, a widow, who had once been counting down the days until she lost everything, now stood at her kitchen window, watching water she would never lose again catch the last of the winter light, and understood exactly what it felt like to stop running out of time.